Hello, hello, and welcome again to a Beatles program, which we call Things We Said Today. This is a weekly podcast. It's a conversation about the Beatles in which we talk about anything we feel like, their past, the present. I'm Ken Michaels, one of the 4 regular co-hosts of the show, also known for my weekly Beatles syndicated show called Every Little Thing, being joined by my 3 other co-hosts. First of all, the writer for Beatles Examiner, we have Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
Also, longtime writer for Beatle Fan Magazine. Been with them since the very beginning, Al Sussman. Hi, Al.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
And we also have our resident musicologist and longtime writer for the New York Times. He used to write for their classical department, now a freelance writer, Alan Kozin. Hi, Alan.
Hey, Ken. Hello, everyone.
On the program this time, we're going to be doing a special salute to Sir George Martin, who on January the 3rd will be turning, fingers crossed, 90 years old. So we're going to be talking about him and his massive contribution to the Beatles and to the world of music in just a few moments. But before we do that, we just want to bring up very quickly the big news item in the past week of the Beatles music now being offered on 9 different streaming services. And it has proven to be extremely popular. And Steve has written a number of articles on this. And I thought, Steve, why don't you just tell the folks more about this, and we'll all kind of chime in.
Well, I think what was interesting was when they announced before Christmas, or it actually leaked out before Christmas first, and then they announced it officially. And I think a lot of, especially older fans, myself included, kind of underestimated how popular this would be, how big this was. But it turns out it's been very big. They have, Spotify contacted me yesterday and confirmed the stats that have been floating around, that the songs have been added to over 673,000 playlists. And that what's really interesting is that 65% of its listeners on Spotify listening to the Beatles are 34 years or younger, which means they were born after the Beatles broke up. But beyond that, I mean, the significance is that it makes the Beatles music a lot more available to everybody, not just younger people, although apparently younger people are the ones that are really into it. And so, I mean, this is something, again, like iTunes, the Beatles resisted for a long time. You know, we don't know why all of a sudden what financial arrangements they made to make this happen, or whether they just decided to go with it. But I mean, obviously they're getting paid for this, and how much they're getting paid for, we don't know. But it's just I think it needs to be mentioned, and I think also, people who are saying big deal should be aware that there's a lot of people that are for whom this is really a big deal. And garnering comments from Facebook, a lot. There were people both ways who said, no, I don't care. And there were other people who said, oh, this is fantastic. And there are a lot of people for whom this is really fantastic. So there you go.
Well, we've often talked about this, that the name of the game in a music catalog thriving is to always reach new generations of people and younger people. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, this is extremely important. Just like when the Beatles were offered on iTunes. That was a big deal at the time. 5 years ago now, but it still was a big deal. So, Alan, you want to offer your comments about this?
I think that everything that you've said about reaching younger audience is true, and but I mean, for someone of I guess my age or our ages, it's sort of, Spotify is sort of like fundamentally the radio, except of course you can program it, which is an improvement over the radio. But it's kind of like saying the Beatles are going to be on the radio. You're going to hear them, but you're not going to own the tracks. And I guess one aspect of the generation gap as it currently is that young listeners don't necessarily feel the need to own a copy of the stuff that they like. And it's kind of hard for me to understand that. But okay, if that's the way it is, it's the way it is. But I've never trusted the cloud, so to speak. I mean, I use the cloud. I've got plenty of stuff up there. But I always feel like, I want a copy of Sgt. Pepper on my shelf in case whatever service I might listen to it on goes down or whatever. I want it available to me here, and I want to look at the cover. I want to look at the inside, all of that stuff. Apparently, these things aren't that important to younger listeners now. But on the other hand, you see them going out and buying vinyl versions of things. So I guess you can't even generalize these days. But it's great that they're on there. It's great that the numbers are what they are. To put it in some perspective, however, and I'm not sure exactly how to read this perspective, one news report this morning had the headline, Justin Bieber crushes Beatles on streaming, because his new current song has been streamed something like 129 million times as opposed to whatever. But I mean, the Beatles have been available for like 4 days as we speak now, and that song has been available for a while. So I'm not sure how you really even compare those things, but it was an unfortunate headline, I thought, personally.
Really?
It's kind of interesting. How do you gauge the popularity of an artist now? Is it more how many streams they get? Is that more important than the sales? Al,
it's getting to that point, actually, because one of the major labels announced last week that I think that they had accumulated more revenue from streaming than from downloading, and certainly from physical sales. So it's getting to that point. But what I find kind of amusing is this, all of this wide-eyed surprise that younger people are interested in Beatles music, which is, I figured that that's been a fact of life for a very long time. Anybody who comes to the Fest for Beatles fans can see that the vast majority of the attendees at the fest now, I don't know about percentage, but certainly of the vast majority are younger people, are people in their 30s and 20s and teens and tweens, etc. The people that are, my age are definitely in a minority now. And of course, there's the example of One. The huge success of that album is, greatly attributable to young people because, again, people my age, really had no use. They had no particular need unless they were ardent collectors who had to have everything. They really had no need for that album, and yet it became this phenomenon. So the fact that the vast majority of people that are streaming Beatles music are younger people is hardly a surprise. But media being what it is, they blow it up into this big story. But it's not of great interest. Kind of in the same bag with Alan, in that even though I use some of those streaming services, the fact that Beatles music is on there really doesn't really mean anything to me because I have Beatles music in so many other different formats. So and most of us, certainly people again of my vintage, usually listen to them either on vinyl or on CDs or whatever. We don't really listen that much to them on digital, other than the fact that a lot of us, especially when the 2009 remasters came out, a lot of us did indeed take those CDs, put them into our iTunes libraries and then made playlists from them. But to go now into, say, Spotify to get Beatles music now really doesn't mean that much to me. But again, for young people, it's pretty much the norm.
Well, everything you said there, Al, lends itself to a full show.
Yeah.
But now, just to make a quick comment there, we live in a culture where we're kind of taught that whatever we've grown up on, whether it's music or TV shows or films, that's what we were exposed to in our youth. And so it appeals to that generation first, more than anybody else. And it's almost like it's a surprise when decades later, younger people discover the same things that we liked. Yeah. So, that's the way people think these days. I still come across people who, when I bring up the Beatles, they'll say to me, well, that's from your generation. You're always going to find people who are like that think that way because that's the way that we're raised in this culture.
Sure.
But, it's kind of funny. You just said something about the Beatles 1. I was surprised at the success of the Beatles 1. So were you.
Sure.
And why would you be surprised if, like you said, new generations are always discovering their music? So, there is that thought in the back of our minds because that's the way that we're raised, that the music of the past is probably not going to attract the young people of today because that's the music we grew up with. That reached out to us. And the young people can't relate to it. I'm not just talking about the Beatles. I'm talking about everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it is pretty remarkable that whether it's the Beatles 1, whether it's the remasters, iTunes, whatever it is, somehow young people are still discovering the Beatles, regardless of how old this music is. And that's a testament to how great the music is.
Absolutely. It's just that the story that young people are turning on to Beatles music through the streams. It just seems that it's certainly not a new phenomenon. That that young people have been turning on to Beatles music for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not it's not as if all of a sudden young people are listening to them only through the streaming. It's something that's been going on for a pretty long time now.
Right.
Can I just make one more observation about we're a little bit format obsessed these days. I mean, not that we're really obsessed, but somehow whenever there's a new format, it becomes a news story that, isn't necessarily really a news story. It's just available in some other way. And it sort of reminded me of, years and years ago, maybe 20 years ago, maybe a little more, when maybe 30, when online was beginning to happen in a big way and newspapers were looking over their shoulders at what was going on, and not a lot of newspapers were online yet, but everyone was thinking about it. And at the Times, we had sort of a big full staff meeting with Arthur Sulzberger, who's the publisher of the Times. And he said at one point, I am format agnostic. I'm not married to the idea that the New York Times has to be printed on paper. If I could beam it directly to your cerebral cortex, I would do it. And, in a way, it's exactly the same thing with music. I mean, okay, now it's streaming. Maybe someday they'll be able to beam it directly to our cerebral cortex.
Yeah.
But it'll just be another way to hear the stuff. And it's kind of interesting, but it may be less of an amazing, news story than it's being made to be. See what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'd like to close this topic with one quick question to ask everybody, and I don't mean to play devil's advocate here, but that when it comes to embracing new technology and all, the Beatles and their music, it seems like they're always one of the last to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It took them a long time to be on iTunes, and they're one of the last holdouts here for streaming. Do you think that part of the appeal and part of the reason why they've done so well with the streaming is because they waited so long and there is this big build-up? Is that part of the plan to make it successful because then people are craving it? They want it more and more. when the Beatles music is one of the most noticeable ones out there that's not available, and suddenly it becomes a big news item. So is that part of the reason why it's successful now?
Well, Freud would probably say that what they're doing is taking the 1940s approach to sex as it was when they grew up and turning it into a marketing philosophy. Why buy the cow when you could have the milk for free? I don't know. It seems a little that way. In the case of CDs, they came late to it because EMI came late to it.
Yeah.
They didn't put out the first Beatles CDs till 87.
Right.
And, CD came out in 83, 84, depending what part of the world you were living in. And everybody was clamoring for it. And, in a way, the fact that everybody was clamoring for it and the same on iTunes and the same on streaming has kind of made it into, wow, well, here it is finally. Let's go listen to it or buy it or whatever it is. And maybe that's true.
All right,
I think it's because the audience is there. Now the streaming, the various streaming platforms have become so big that there's a huge ready-made audience there. And the fact that young people have shown themselves for quite a period of time, as I just mentioned, toward Beatles music, just means that the music is now being offered to this very large audience. So it's cause and effect.
But if the music was made available when everybody else's music was made available, so the Beatles didn't stand out, would it be doing as well?
I think it's a little different. I think it's a case of supply. I mean, there's so much more music out there now that I don't think that people can't afford to buy it, and they wouldn't anyway because there's so many more formats available than there used to be. I mean, back in the 60s, you only had vinyl. You have a lot more than that now. And I think, what the streaming does is it gives people access to more music that they don't necessarily have to own. I mean, they can keep it with them at all times, but they don't necessarily. It's like leasing a car almost. I don't know. I've never leased a car, but I mean, it's kind of like that. You pay for it, but you don't own it. I mean, that's the same thing here. So,
all right, all different ways of looking at this. It's kind of different for my brain to think. If people are not buying it, is it still the same result? But then again, I go on YouTube all the time and listen to music that I don't buy. And sometimes I go on YouTube and listen to music that I have already, but I'm too lazy to pick up the CD and program it. So it's the same thing, really. So let's move on here to George Martin, who, as I said, January 3rd will be turning 90 years old. We owe so much to this man. It's kind of hard to imagine the Beatles story without his massive contribution to the group. So there's so much to talk about here of what he brought to the group, but how about just talking about his background before we even discuss his work with the Beatles? Who wants to start with that?
That should probably be Alan, because certainly with George's classical music background, I'm sure Alan can give us a good perspective on that.
Okay. Well, as Al said, it was fundamentally classical, but not purely classical. I mean, he also was into a sort of jazz and the popular music of his time when he was growing up. He grew up, I think, in a relatively working class kind of home. He learned piano. He ended up studying the oboe with Jane Asher's mother, in fact. And then went into the Air Force. He had he was in the dance band in the RAF and did some music of his own there. And then when he got out and I think he was playing in Sadler's Wells Orchestra, which is an opera orchestra in England. and sort of lucked into the job at EMI when there was an assistantship opening, and he applied for it. And he was, in those days, I think it was looked upon more favorably than it is now that you have some actual musical background if you want to be a record executive. Now I don't think it's really regarded as that important, but it served him well in that case, because also as the head of Parlophone, or even as the assistant to the head of Parlophone at the time, I mean, part of his job was doing arrangements. People would come in to record something, and it would be his job to sort of say, okay, this would be good for 20 strings and brass winds, etc., and then sort of score it out and do the sessions that way. And that was part of what he contributed to the Beatles too. Not entirely, what he did for the Beatles. I mean, some of what he contributed to them was just a kind of musical sensibility, I mean, not adding strings necessarily, but maybe it would be good if the intro took a bit from this, and there was I think a really important give and take with them. And John sometimes liked to downplay George Martin's influence, but I think when it really came down to it, even John sort of probably knew what George Martin's contributions to them were. And I think without his classical background, he couldn't have done a lot of what he did with the Beatles. I mean, the scoring of Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby and a lot of the ideas he came up with, simply knowing how instruments work, what would be good for No One, what kind of instrument would be good to have that solo in the middle, and the Beatles had their own ideas. Obviously, they came in with, Paul came in having heard a Bach Brandenburg concerto and wanted the high Baroque trumpet on Penny Lane, but having someone like George Martin there who would know exactly what he was talking about and what musician to call is very crucial. So I think that's probably all we need to say about the classical background, but it's not an unimportant detail.
But also in those early years at Parlophone, he also produced comedy records.
Right.
He produced Peter Sellers and Spike Milligan. He produced original cast albums. So he had this incredible background, very versatile, which proved to be, so important. And he was ready for the Beatles. Obviously, the Beatles didn't know how far they'd be taking their careers and how creative they were going to become. But, when the time came when they needed the scoring for an Eleanor Rigby, or, say, Strawberry Fields Forever, George Martin proved to be the perfect man for that in so many ways by having this incredible background.
There was another important thing early in his career. He made these electronic records, with overdubbing and when the technology was even more primitive than it was when the Beatles got there, he was putting together these sort of electronic semi-novelty records, but it involved a lot of techniques that he ended up using later with the Beatles, the sort of overdubbing and playing with speeds and all that kind of stuff, and that again made him perfect producer for them. I mean, who knows what would have happened if they signed with Decca, I'm not sure they could have gotten a producer with the combination of skills and background that George Martin had. I mean, it's very unlikely that they would have. So the electronic thing too in his early records is worth mentioning.
What was it? What do you have some examples of the electronic record, Alan?
Yeah, I'm just looking in his in that box set. Can't think of the title, but he did them under sort of pen names like Ray Cathode. That one.
Okay.
I can't remember the title of the record, but they would be his own compositions and his own productions, and he would be doing the music and put them out under those names. So and between that and the comedy things that he did, I mean, that also made him perfect person for them because they knew stuff. They knew his comedy stuff.
And of course, and he did the Peter Sellers Beatle parodies. that were good on two fronts, because Sellers was close to them, and he was close to them. And there's a Peter Sellers box set that I guess it's out of print now, but you can still find it, that has actually some unreleased Beatles stuff, or Beatles covers by Sellers in it.
Yeah.
So,
and meanwhile, at about the same time that George was doing those electronic records, he was also dipping his toe into rock and roll with the Vipers Skiffle Band. Made a single called "No Other Baby," which Paul McCartney, in fact, covered years later, and also mainstream pop. He was the producer of a fairly big hit, but certainly a big hit in England and a pretty big hit in America for Matt Monro in 1961, called "My Kind of Girl."
Right.
So he was really all over the place in terms of the kind of the musical landscape that he was surveying.
He was also producer of Goldfinger by Shirley Bassey.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, which I mean, I was really stunned when I found that out. I did an article a couple of years ago just pulling out some of the lesser known tracks, and the My Kind of Girl and No Other Baby were two of the ones I found. But when I found Goldfinger, I had to look. I had to, really? But, yeah. So, wow. That's amazing. Amazing. And he also, another track I found was a song called I've Been Wrong Before, done by Cilla Black, that was written by Randy Newman, and was one of the first covers of a Randy Newman song.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, he also issued on Parlophone, there was a Goons album,
right,
where it was take on Bridge on the River Kwai, but it was called Bridge on the River Wye. And there would have been a problem if they had used Kwai, so he had to take all the K's out. He had to edit that out of the record. So, yeah, he had all this enormous experience, which proved to be so valuable for the Beatles later on.
The Goon stuff was very, very pre-Monty Python. I mean, anybody that likes Monty Python would love the Goons, because they're, and I think the Pythons have acknowledged the Goons.
Oh, sure.
Very, very much so. So, yeah, there's a definite link between the Goons and Monty Python.
Mm-hmm.
And the Beatles.
Yeah, that's it.
It's all one family.
Yeah.
Right.
There's so many times when I'll see something the Beatles did, and I'll think it's Monty Python-esque, especially in Magical Mystery Tour.
Yeah.
But they probably got it from the Goons.
Yeah.
So,
possibly, yeah.
And even those two, the as we were talking a couple of weeks ago, the 66 and 67 Beatles fan club Christmas messages are very, very much Goons influenced.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. That's a really good point.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the many contributions George Martin made to the Beatles' music, some of which may not be as well known as others. In particular, I'm thinking about Please Please Me, where the Beatles originally had it as a slow song, and as John used to call it, very Roy Orbison-esque. But it was George Martin who suggested to speed it up, which made all the difference in the world, apparently, because when he heard the Beatles do it, the new version of it, he was convinced that it would be their first number one, which it was on many of the British charts. And also, the song Can't Buy Me Love is another example of, well, originally they were going to start the song with the verses, but George Martin suggested to start with the chorus. So as soon as you hear, the beginning of Can't Buy Me Love, you're immediately taken in with the song. So it was just a great suggestion right there in the arrangement of that song.
And of course, the best example, I think, of everything is Strawberry Fields Forever. All the work that he did with that. I mean, that's just amazing what he did there.
Well, all the orchestral stuff that he did was just so brilliant. And I like to point to the ones that are overlooked sometimes, like Good Night. One amazing arrangement was done on that. And I believe the Mike Sam singers also sing in that, as they did on I Am the Walrus.
Right.
So, you've got not only the string instruments, but you've got, vocals added to it, kind of like a choir. So, he had to think of all that too. Let me ask all of you a question here, because very often you hear about producer versus engineer. And sometimes people may not know the difference. And in the story of the Beatles, you've got all these names like Norman Smith and certainly Jeff Emmerich, who brought so much innovation. Everybody points to him for all the close miking techniques that he brought to the Beatles. But also, people like Ken Scott, Phil McDonald, those people. How much credit do you give to them as opposed to the producer? Can the producer sometimes be kind of overrated in his contribution? And maybe you should be giving more of the credit to what the engineers bring to the table. Who wants to add something on that?
It's a team, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But, the producer is where the buck stops, I mean, all of them undoubtedly made important contributions. Some of the engineers probably, I think in the way it's supposed to be delineated, the producer is the one who's supposed to come up with all of the ideas about how to get the sound, and the engineers simply execute what they do. But, in the case of the Beatles at EMI, the demands that they were making were such that the engineers had maybe technical skills in terms of the electronics that George Martin didn't necessarily have. His were musical. And so they all contributed various things. I mean, George Martin might not have been able to come up with ADT, the automatic double track. He was automatic double tracking or that kind of thing. I mean, that was a technical innovation. So, there were contributions from everywhere, but finally, I think the music is the issue, and that was where his big contributions were. I think taste and sensibility were sort of what he brought to things.
Right.
It's also probably, we were talking just a few minutes ago about arranging and all the arrangements he did. I mean, and it's also interesting to keep in mind that all of these arrangements, the Beatles arrangements that we're talking about, I mean, he sort of did just about overnight. It's not like, okay, in 2 months we're going to do some tracks where we need orchestral arrangements, and here's a demo of the song. You can do the orchestral arrangements from that. In a lot of cases, it was sort of they'd go into the studio and record, and then 2 days later, he'd be there with his arrangement and the people to play it. And it's the speed involved and the deftness is kind of an interesting thing too. I mean, something like Strawberry Fields, I mean, he had a little bit of time for that, but not much, and for a score that complicated. So
that's interesting. You can apply that to how quickly the Beatles came up with their material, on the spot, and had to come up with things because they had these deadlines to meet, and yet they were able to crank out so much strong material very quickly. So it applied to both the songwriting as well as the arranging. What are, to you, the best arrangements that George Martin brought to the Beatles' music? How about you, Al?
The funny thing is, when you said arrangements, the one that sprang to mind was She's Leaving Home, except that he didn't do the arrangement for that.
That's right.
But certainly, Ella, well, I guess yesterday, the fact that George was inspired to add just a string quartet on as instead of a full orchestral backing, just something very, very tasteful to kind of accompany what was basically simply Paul and his guitar. So
wasn't the story, correct me if I'm wrong here, didn't George Martin want to have more of an orchestra for that song, and Paul told him he didn't want it to sound like Mantovani?
I think so. And then he said, well, how about a string quartet?
Right.
And that was much more accessible for Paul. But then on Eleanor Rigby, where there is a much fuller backing. It's, in fact, especially if you listen to the backing track, which was on the second anthology set. I mean, it's just a beautiful, beautiful piece just on its own, even without the vocal.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that certainly has to go in and as one of as a favorite.
Yeah, you just mentioned the backing tracks on Anthology 2. You got to point out Within You, Without You, which I love to bring out too, because it's that marriage of the Indian instruments with all the the Western instruments
Yes,
as well.
absolutely.
So, and what skill that took
Mhm.
to have a marriage of those two together. I mean, that was so brilliant in and of itself.
Well,
Steve, how about you?
Well, I was going to say Within You Without You, but I was thinking more of the tempos, not necessarily the merging of the cultures, but the various tempos that were mixed together on that track were just absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it was just, and I think I think a lot of people for obvious reasons will give credit to George Harrison, but yeah, George Martin definitely deserves credit there too. I mean, that's brilliant the way that goes. The other song I would think of would be Eleanor Rigby. I don't think so much of Yesterday, only because the arrangement, the string quartet was very kind of plain, whereas Eleanor Rigby was a little more complex, so. But yeah, between Within You Without You and Eleanor Rigby, those two are just absolutely amazing.
And Alan mentioned Good Night, which is that might be more of a favorite for me than even the others that I mentioned, because it's just so beautiful. And the funny thing, I always thought, because after, with all the brouhaha that came up after Spector added an orchestra and voices and all onto the Long and Winding Road, that, why wasn't there this same kind of brouhaha over Good Night from, say, unreconstructed rockers who think, well, this is a rock and roll band. What are all these strings doing on here? But it's a beautiful, beautiful arrangement.
One other song that none of us mentioned, and I'm surprised, Ken, that you didn't mention it, was "Live and Let Die."
Well, we haven't gotten to the solo music yet.
Well, I mean, we're talking about George Martin, and I mean that particular song. I mean, he, and the way Paul, uses that now. I mean, in his concerts. But I mean, that's just, that's amazing too.
Right.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you couldn't have found a better producer for Live and Let Die than George Martin. How about you, Alan?
Well, a lot of the ones that were mentioned, I mean, Eleanor Rigby was actually still pretty spare. It was a string octet. So it was basically the same ensemble as played on Yesterday, but doubled, twice as many. I don't think that the arrangement for Yesterday is quite as simple as Steve mentioned. It has some beautiful touches in it. But, often that's the case with really well-crafted music. It seems simpler than it is. I agree about Within You Without You, and the amazing thing about that, in a way, is that when you listen to some of the comments George Martin made around the time of Anthology, where he talked about how, he only later came to realize what a good song it was. If you sort of backtrack and you think, okay, well, so he did that incredible arrangement thinking it was basically just a throwaway track that he didn't even care that much for, and yet really came up with an incredible score that wrapped around the Indian instruments, or it was in dialogue with the Indian instruments in a really beautiful way. But, I mean, that again is a sort of a quality of a first-class musician. There is no throwaway music. You're doing something publicly. You do the best you can do, whether you personally think it's the greatest track in the world or not. The story of She's Leaving Home is kind of interesting because it was, I think that was a little bit of a power play. George Martin was unavailable when they wanted that arrangement done, and so they just called up the next guy, which is kind of, it's hard not to read that as Paul saying basically, okay, you work for us and we come first, and it's a pity. I mean, that's a nice arrangement, but I think it wasn't probably necessary to do it that way. And I'd be really interested to know what kind of arrangement George Martin would have come up with for that song. I think, the horn scoring on For No One, it's really just a fairly short part, but it's beautiful. And he found one of the best horn players in England to do it. When Alan Civil died, I wrote his obituary, and he was known for a lot of classical repertory. I mean, his Mozart horn concertos are great. He works with Benjamin Britten, stuff like that. But most people, in terms of the numbers of people involved, most people know him for that solo, and he acknowledged as much. It's quoted in the Lewison books, saying, I meet people in airports, and do they say they like my Mozart? No, it's this solo I played in the Beatles song that was like 53 seconds long, or maybe less. And I put that in the op-ed, and one of my editors the next day said, you've completely distorted this guy's life. And, which I don't think is fair, because he said so himself. But, as French horn solos go, that is really stunning. And, it's the kind of thing George Martin could write. I mean, he just had an ear for exactly what they needed at the time. And Strawberry Fields is another one. If you listen to, as you can on certain semi-legal, perhaps even totally illegal recordings, you listen to just the orchestral take, even without the vocals. You hear that, he took Paul's intro, the Mellotron intro, and he put it in the brass. And that's kind of interesting, because he wasn't taking the cue of the sounds Paul was using, which were flute sounds. He made it into a brass thing. He changed the key because he wanted to use the open bottom string of the cello, because an open string is going to resonate in a way that a stopped string isn't. So he just wanted that sound. I mean, he so completely knew what he was doing all the time. And that turned out to be really lucky, because if he hadn't changed that key for the sake of getting that open tone, then when John wanted the two versions joined, he wouldn't have been able to do it, because it was the fact that they were in two different keys that made it possible, and two different tempos. So he sort of lucked out there, but the arrangement itself is really incredible.
The tempos thing is what always gets me.
Yeah.
The fact that they did it so much faster
in
that second version, it just, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like we said in our Beatles Miracle show. It's like, how is it possible they could have done two different versions like that? You speed one up, you slow one down, and then they match. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, for the same money, they could have done the one in the higher key slower, and that would have made it impossible. Everything just fell together,
I want to very quickly just mention the fact that George Martin played piano on quite a lot of Beatles songs, and so many solos, and very fast ones. I shouldn't say fast, very concise ones, were just what was necessary for the record. I mean, I think of Not a Second Time.
In My Life.
In My Life, yeah, absolutely.
In My Life is definitely, and what was interesting about In My Life is that he actually recorded it at half speed on the tape. So when he played it back, it actually sounded, it was on a piano, and it sounds like a harpsichord when you hear the release version. I love his piano playing on Rocky Raccoon. It's got that, what would you call it?
Barrel
Not ragtime.
house. Sort of barrel house.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And Lovely Rita is kind of the same way. So very important parts of the songs, short parts of the songs, but important nonetheless, came from George Martin on a lot of Beatle records. Also, Hard Day's Night, the piano solo in there too.
That's right. And Rock and Roll Music, where he plays one of the pianos.
Yeah, well, there's three. There's John, Paul, and George Martin playing the piano on that song. Yeah. All right, let's since you mentioned Live and Let Die, Steve, I wanted to bring up George Martin's work with Paul in particular as a solo artist. Beyond Live and Let Die, you've got Tug of War, Pipes of Peace, and Give My Regards to Broad Street. And we've talked a bit about Tug of War and Pipes of Peace recently. Certainly Tug of War to me is one of the great masterpieces in Paul's solo career. But even when you go later into Paul's solo career, he did some work on the Flaming Pie album, did some of the arrangements on Some Days, which is a gorgeous song. as is Beautiful Night and Calico Skies. And he also did the arrangement on We All Stand Together, which I think was absolutely brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people make fun of that record, but it was a song for an animated film. And it worked well in that format.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you think about a song for kids, you know, We All Stand Together fits perfectly for that kind of song. And again, like I said about Live and Let Die, you couldn't have found a better arranger than George Martin. When you need someone with Paul McCartney to do strings and horns, who better than George Martin?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, We All Stand Together absolutely is a masterful arrangement.
I love that song.
You know, it's a beautiful record. You know, it's just too bad that people here in the U.S. really don't know it, because Thomas, at least, or because Rupert the Bear, is really so much a British animated character.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Alan, you want to add anything on this?
No, I basically agree with what's been said. I've a couple of other things that I wanted to comment on sort of more generally about his production. And one is, you know, maybe I should have said this more towards the beginning, but he had a feeling that also is yet another one of these things that made him perfect for the Beatles, which is that he felt that the producer's job and the job of someone capturing sound for a record should not simply be that the record wasn't simply a pipeline from the stage to your living room. And in his time, when he was much younger, a lot of producers felt that it was, and a lot of artists felt that it was, that, you know, I'm going in the studio, I'm playing my thing, you're capturing it exactly as it is, and you're putting it out there. George Martin recognized that a record was a different thing, and that you could do things like speed things up and slow things down, and that basically you were making a sound painting, not just capturing a bunch of people in a room playing. And that was an attitude that maybe in the beginning of the Beatles didn't come out so much, because he was pretty much capturing them, but in an idealized way, you know. But once they started overdubbing and bringing in different things, different kinds of instruments, playing with speeds, that kind of stuff, I mean, that was exactly in his wheelhouse, so to speak. And the other thing I wanted to mention before I forget, as we get onto the solo things, is that he also made a really important contribution to the world of production itself. And it's partly because EMI was so parsimonious. You know, he went in, I think, in 1965 for a contract renewal, having made all the money for EMI that he did in 1964 and 65 and late 63, and they were going to give him really a pittance as a raise. And he and John Burgess and some other British producers from other labels banded together and started an independent production company called AIR. Can't remember what AIR actually stands for.
Associated Independent
Recorders.
Right.
Yeah. And that was kind of an important, you know, there were obviously independent producers like Phil Spector and others in the United States, but it was very unheard of in England, mostly unheard of in England, and certainly someone of his prominence stepping outside the employ of a major record label. And, you know, the Beatles were obviously interested in continuing working with him, and they were in a position to tell EMI, no, we're not going to go with whatever staff producer you replace him with. We want him. And that, I think, was, you know, simply in the world of record production, that was a very important move.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, you know, I just think that should be mentioned too.
Well put. And I always remember George Martin always using that phrase, sound painting.
Mm-hmm.
He liked to use that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's just bring up very quickly Ringo's first album, Sentimental Journey, because George Martin actually produced that album. And sometimes people forget that fact. I really think that, you know, Ringo was ahead of his time without trying to be ahead of his time. he just wanted to put out an album of standards to please his parents, basically. These are all songs that he grew up hearing, as the other Beatles did too. But how do you feel George Martin fit in that role as producer for that particular album? An album of all standards. Why don't we start with Steve?
I think that, I don't see anything out of the ordinary as far as, George Martin was a, longtime producer. He'd been through all sorts of music, of, different kinds. I don't think that was really out of the ordinary. Maybe the only odd thing about it was the fact that it was Ringo. If you want to, maybe Ringo was the one that was really experimenting there and not George Martin.
Well, I don't know if Ringo knew how he wanted to start his solo career. It's just what he was doing in the moment. I'm not saying this is out of the ordinary for George Martin because, like we've discussed, he had such a full background anyway. But and Ringo's voice really suited a lot of the songs on that particular album. They didn't require that big a vocal range, at least these particular arrangements. Mm-hmm. But any thoughts from you, Alan and Al, about Sentimental Journey and George Martin and whether or not you feel he brought what was necessary for that album?
One thing that is kind of out of the ordinary is that there were a number of arrangers on the album. So we were talking before about all the different arrangements that George had brought to the Beatles, or had given to the Beatles. But for this particular album, he was more of a background figure, as a producer, and let others like Maurice Gibb, like Paul McCartney, like various others Quincy Jones, yes, absolutely,
mm-hmm.
do the arranging, and it's part of the because that was I think people underestimate how much of a kind of a landmark album that was, because it really was the first time that a contemporary rock artist did an album of pop standards, and it really set the template, if you will, for the Harry Nilssons and Willie Nelsons and
Linda
Ronstadt, and later on Rod Stewart and all of doing albums of pop standards.
And Paul McCartney.
And sure, absolutely, sure.
Also, since we mentioned Ringo, there's a song called "I'm Yours," which closes the Vertical Man album, and George Martin did the string arrangement on that song, a real tender ballad, which was really nice. So, a few things that he brought to later Beatles projects. For example, on, actually a solo one here, the Lennon Anthology, he and Giles Martin worked on the orchestral arrangement for Grow Old With Me.
Oh, yeah.
Added a real nice touch on that.
Mm-hmm.
And in a similar way, on the Beatles' Love,
yes,
they did the same thing for While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Mm-hmm.
For the acoustic demo that George made. And, both recordings are just gorgeous.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
We're all very agreeable.
Uh-huh.
And yet at the same time, roughly the same time, he was also producing a band as hard-edged, although with a definite Beatles influence, as Cheap Trick.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, it was a natural for them to want to choose George Martin, as America did as well.
Yes.
And just to mention a few of the artists outside of the Beatles that George Martin produced, we have to mention some of those 60s acts that were in the Brian Epstein stable.
Sure.
Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, Cilla Black, Jerry and the Pacemakers. Also, like you mentioned, Al, Matt Monro. Later on, America, Jimmy Webb, Jeff Beck, the Blow by Blow album.
Yeah.
Mahavishnu Orchestra.
Right.
He also produced Elton John, that recording of Candle in the Wind.
Right.
The one that was the tribute to
Princess Diana.
Right. That was like one of the biggest selling singles ever worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
So, his contributions go far beyond just the Beatles.
Yeah.
I think if you especially have to mention Cilla Black. I mean, there's a couple of compilations that they've put out, and I happen to own both of them. One is a 3 CD set of just all her all stuff he did, and the other is a 6-disc 5 CD 1 DVD set that is mostly George Martin. I mean, that's quite a bit of production there. I mean, while the Beatles, of course, get first mention when you talk about George Martin, I think Cilla probably should get second, because he did so much. He did so much with her. And another song that I don't think we mentioned was "Ferry Across the Mersey," which he also did.
Sure.
So,
Well, would you say Cilla was more important in George's career than, say, Billy J. Kramer or Jerry and the Pacemakers?
Oh yeah.
in terms of sheer numbers of songs, yeah, I think you almost have to say that. I mean, granted, Billy J. especially, got more recognition over here than she did, but I mean, the fact is, Cilla still is a big name in England and big business, over there. I think you have to, recognize that has continued to live on, and she's still, like I said, she's put out some major compilations within the past couple of years of the stuff that he did with her, including outtakes and everything that are actually pretty good. I mean, if you like, especially that Step Inside Love outtake that with McCartney on it is interesting.
Well, every now and then there are new compilations that come out on Billy J. Kramer too, as well as Jerry and the Pacemakers. So.
Right.
But just the fact that there's such a large body of work that the two of them worked on together. Really second only to the Beatles. Right.
I mean, I'm looking at the Completely Cilla, which is the 5 CDs, 1 DVD set, and I think there's roughly like pretty close to it, like 125 tracks here. I mean, that's a lot, and they go all the way back. I'd have to open it up and see what year, but I'm guessing 62. They start, and in fact, the cover of the book has her and George Martin on it. So, and in fact, it has an interview with George Martin in it. So,
yeah, I know George Martin has said he really loved working with Cilla. He thought the world of her. So,
I think a difference as well is that Jerry and the Pacemakers and Billy J. are essentially, sort of oldies acts. I mean, they still do things and they're still out there, but they're mainly looking backwards at the things that they did. Whereas Cilla had a career that, continued, towards the present. I mean, she, with TV and everything else that she did, I mean, she... Yeah, you see, what I'm saying? I mean, she continued to sort of unfold in a way that they didn't, much as I love Jerry the Pacemakers and Billy J. Kramer.
Well, don't tell Billy J. that, because he's forever pushing his new music, and he's very proud of, he made a new album recently called I Won the Fight, and he co-wrote many of the songs on the album, and when you see him in concert, he does several of those songs. It's not just an oldies show. He doesn't want to be known as an oldies act, but he's kind of pushed in that direction because those are the offers that he gets most of the time.
Yeah.
So,
especially over here, and I think I don't recall that Cilla ever came back here within the past decade. Is that anybody remember?
Not at all, because she didn't like traveling.
Right. But I mean, had she come back here, she would not have been she would have not have been asked to do her new stuff. Everybody would have been asking her to do the old stuff.
Well, of course, she hadn't recorded in many years. She was, basically the last few chapters of her career were as a TV artist. With with her the Blind Date show, and then other various TV, quiz shows and chat shows and things like that.
Right.
So so really, she didn't really have any really new music, for a goodly portion of her career.
But I mean, the bottom line is that George Martin's work with her was a major chapter in both his life and hers.
Very true.
So.
Yeah. As much as I hate to admit it, most people in America didn't know Cilla Black.
No.
And she was more a footnote in Beatle history here.
Yeah.
Whereas in England, she was the biggest thing. I've heard it said she was the biggest female singer of the 60s in terms of hits in the UK in the 60s. So, but over here, it was just the one single, You're My World, which made the top 40, and that was it.
Yeah.
So, she really wasn't that well known here. I do want to make quick mention of George Martin's success in particular with America, because some of the biggest hits that they had, certainly in the U.S., I always point to Sister Golden Hair, which was a #1 hit here. Always starts off like My Sweet Lord.
Yes.
But yeah, that was George Martin. In the mid-'70s there, George Martin produced a few albums for America, and they really sounded great. They were a good team together.
See, I wasn't so much an America fan, really, but I admired the things he did with, I like Jeff Beck's Blow by Blow. And Apocalypse Now, is that what it was? Apocalypse, just Apocalypse, the John McLaughlin album. That was a really kind of difficult project because it was basically an electric guitar concerto with jazz band and full symphony orchestra. And I've heard that the recording of that was as problematic as some of the big Beatles things like A Day in the Life, where they had the orchestra in one room and McLaughlin and his band in another room, and trying to sort of have everybody hear what was going on and sync them up was very difficult. But I think it's a great album. And so when I think of George Martin's non-Beatles productions, post-Beatles non-Beatles productions, those are the ones that stand out for me. Sort of aware that he did America, but for some reason America just didn't do it for me. Hey, we can finally disagree on something on this show. Let's go for it.
I was going to say the Scylla stuff really stands out for me, partially because I have it, because I really like her stuff. I mean, she was a great singer, and I'm glad that he was the one that helped her.
All right, let's wrap things up with a couple of quick questions here. I know that several years back, Howard Stern made some comment about George Martin, complaining that George was taking too much credit for the Beatles' success. And like you were saying before, Alan, John had said something to the effect that, what was George Martin without us? After the Beatles broke up, what was he doing? Nothing. At least that's what John had said in his own mind. He thought that way. Is there too much credit being given to this man, or do we think that, he's so much an important part of this story? I mean, to me, it's pretty obvious. I really can't see the Beatles story unfolding the way that it did without the massive, it's incomprehensible, the contribution that George Martin made. But do you think sometimes it's kind of overrated, or is it like you said before, or we said before, give and take on both sides?
I think, the only degree to which I would say is overrated is when you get people come up to you and say, "Oh, well, it was all George Martin." He was the one who did all their stuff, and it's, that's not really true. It's not even really remotely true. I think that there was a chemistry between him and them that they would not have had with any other producer, and I think that he was an absolutely essential ingredient to a lot of their greatest stuff. And the fact that, even their very early stuff, the way it was done, and you can argue whether or not, he, these days post Lewis in Volume 1,
yes,
it's harder to say that he was the only one who had the perspicacity to sign them because maybe he was forced into it. But nevertheless, I mean, there was something about the chemistry between George Martin and the Beatles that made their sound and what they did, possible. Look, you can listen to the Decca audition, and okay, it had Pete Best in it rather than Ringo, and that was a big difference. I think that it's kind of clear that they really blossomed once they were in their partnership with George Martin, and I accept to give him complete credit for everything they did, which people weirdly sometimes do. Except for that, I don't think that you can really exaggerate his importance. He just was absolutely crucial.
And of course, you also have to give credit to George Martin for allowing the Beatles to blossom the way that they did.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to come up with all the ideas and to accept them.
Well, there were a lot of courses, especially in that era. There were a lot of pop acts who who were pigeonholed into one little musical genre. And but Ken is absolutely right that George allowed the Beatles to grow musically in a way that a lot of acts of that even of that era probably were not allowed to. But also, I was going to mention that that those comments from John Lennon were came from that period where he was basically slagging off everybody other than him and Yoko. So I think those comments have to be taken with more than a few grains of salt.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think the using the term allow is probably going to get interpreted by some people in the wrong way. I don't know that allow is probably the best word. I think in the beginning, I think the degree of, the way they worked was different than obviously later on. I think, it evolved over time. I think I think cooperation is probably a better term between the two. I mean, they were very harmonic. They had great harmony together, and I think that's the key there. I mean, it didn't, obviously as they got more famous and they realized what they were, things changed a little bit. But I mean, there was a harmony there that they've acknowledged, that the Beatles have acknowledged, and that is really evident when you look at what they did. So. Anyway.
But even early on, George Martin made some key decisions in the group. I mean, as time goes on, the whole story about how do you do it becomes more and more important to me.
Right.
Because that could have ended up being a single. That could have been a Beatles single. And if that had been a big hit, as it was for Jerry and the Pacemakers, then the Beatles might have had to say, well, you know what you're doing, George. You decide what the next move will be. Maybe he wouldn't have accepted Please Please Me as the next Beatles single. And if Please Please Me hadn't have been the biggest hit, or if Please Please Me hadn't become the huge hit that it was, then maybe George Martin wouldn't have allowed the Beatles singles to be original songs.
That's an interesting what if, but I mean, you can tell by the record they really weren't into it, and I mean whatever even what Lewison says about it, you can say okay, but I mean we don't really know, we weren't there in the studio. So I don't know that it's hard to say exactly what happened, but like I said, the record is the best evidence that they really didn't like it, and I don't think any producer would have gone ahead and tried to release that as a single. I think
But the bottom line is the producer made the final say here.
Mm-hmm.
So he let the Beatles have Please Please Me as their next single. And that changed everything in a way. So in the beginning, George Martin really wanted How Do You Do It to be the Beatles' next single. He believed in that song. He thought it was a hit. And he was proven right with Jerry and the Pacemakers. And you can say all you want, the Beatles didn't put their heart into it. And maybe you hear that. A lot of people do hear that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you hear Dave Morell tell the story when John Lennon played it for him. And he was excited about that song. So I don't know. It's there's a lot of what ifs in the Beatles story, whether you like it or not. The Beatles story, as proven by Mark Lewison, had a lot of twists and turns in it, where things could have gone in a very different direction. And How Do You Do It's one of the key examples of that, at least to me anyway.
It's another aspect of why George Martin was sort of uniquely the person for them. I mean, there was a producer model that was much more common at the time, which is the producer is the boss in the recording studio, and you do what the producer says, and the producer makes a decision. There are a lot of artists out there talking about, looking back and saying, yeah, I didn't want to do this, but he made me, or we wouldn't have released this, but that's what the company did. And George Martin saw it, going all the way back to those early sessions as more of a participatory democracy. He took their views into account. And the other thing is that he let them into the control room. And that was another crucial thing because, they weren't all technical, but Paul certainly was keen on looking into what went on in the mixing board and everything, and George to some degree. Possibly John to some degree. It's hard to tell because George Martin always said he was the least technical of them all. But, the fact that the Beatles got into the control room and could also have a say about what they wanted on the technical side of things is something that, again, if they had signed to Decca, might not have happened, So, there are just so many things that make George Martin the perfect guy. And, that openness to their opinions about what they wanted out there, the openness to letting them take a hand in some production decisions, it's all there.
Mm-hmm.
Just imagine every time that they made some major forward move, say going from Rubber Soul to Revolver, and he just accepted it.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the Beatles had more power then, but still, you got to give George Martin credit for the fact that he allowed them to experiment and grow, and he nurtured them, and he did all this, and, he deserves all the more credit and respect for that.
Yep.
And there's one last thing, without us forgetting. He did do a lot of arranging and composing for A Hard Day's Night, all the instrumental stuff that was done there, which, a lot of Beatle fans love that.
Oh, yeah.
I get requests on my radio show for This Boy every now and then, the arrangement of that, and the music from Yellow Submarine. A lot of people grew up on side 2 of that album, and, it was really just incredible compositions and perfect scoring for that film, which, again, George Martin was so adept at doing.
Yep.
Especially things like Pepperland.
Yeah.
Which, was just, excellent soundtrack music.
Yeah. All right. Anybody want to add anything else as far as George Martin's contribution to the Beatles and music in general?
I guess just that he was the... there are several different, the puzzle that became the Beatles story. There are so many different elements into that, and there are certain extremely important elements to it. Brian Epstein was certainly one, and George Martin was another. A very, very important element. Without him, without Brian Epstein, without Ringo. The story might have had a very, very different, turn.
Exactly. Yep. The Beatles proved to be so incredibly talented with what they gave us musically, but they were also extremely lucky.
Yes.
That things turned out the way that they did.
Yeah.
All right. So, do any of you have anything you'd like to plug?
Let me just quickly mention I did a story on Beatles Examiner yesterday. It was just kind of something that I concocted, and it actually turned out better than I thought it would. Beatle links to some of the people that passed away this year, and there were some surprises in there. A couple of people that I didn't know actually had passed away, but it's an interesting little article. So it's on Beatles Examiner if you're so interested.
I just read it too.
Me too.
Yeah. It's a very, very, it's surprising how many people.
Yeah.
You didn't mention Dennis Ferrante, though. She put Dennis Ferrante.
No, I did not. Ooh, I'm going to have to add him. I'll have to add Dennis in. Thank you for, I knew there was somebody I knew there's somebody I'd miss.
For people who don't know, he was one of John's engineers from Imagine through rock and roll, and a great friend to me and very supportive of my work on the radio on the Beatles. He was a guest on my show many times, and, he made a great contribution to John's music, especially, I've heard it said, a lot of work on Walls and Bridges in particular. And, one of the many people that, unfortunately, we lost in 2015.
Okay. Thank you for reminding me about that. So,
yeah.
There we go.
All right. This has been great talking about George Martin and his great contribution to the Beatles and to the world. And for Things We Said Today, this is Ken Michaels, along with Steve Marinucci, Al Sussman, and Alan Kozin, thanking all of you for listening, and we will see you next time.